He has previously worked across a range of sectors, including financial services, professional services, as well as with academic funders to improve peer review processes with a view to increasing diversity. So in terms of today, Rob is going to share some insights from his research exploring the D&I strategies of FTSE 250 organisations and touch on some really critical questions like, are organisations selecting the right D&I objectives? Which groups are organisations prioritising? And how can the focus be shifted to overlooked groups? After Rob's presentation, we'll then have the opportunity to ask Rob some questions. Please do though pop questions in the chat as Rob is speaking, and I will monitor them and bring them up at bring them to Rob's attention at the end. We'll also open the floor for questions at the end if you'd rather ask a question directly. We'll be recording Rob's presentation for sharing with you after the event and more widely, but recording will be off for the Q&A, so please feel free to ask questions. We'll also make the slides available to you after the event. And just to say, we have been planning on running discussion groups today, but the response to the event has been so overwhelming, so we felt a Q&A would give everyone a better chance of hearing the widest range of questions and insights. So without further ado, Rob, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dan, thank you very much for that introduction. It's really great to be with you here this afternoon. What Dan didn't mention in his introduction of me is that I worked for IES. I started my career with IES back in 2002. And I was due to run my first research network event in 2004, but I then left. So firstly, thank you to IES for having me back. And secondly, if you're waiting to hear me speak, I appreciate you hanging out for 19 years. So I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and how this links into my research on diversity and inclusion strategies. I have been working for the last 20 years as a business psychologist and diversity inclusion specialist. So I've been engaged in an awful lot of consultancy work. And throughout that experience, I have interacted with an awful lot of diversity and inclusion strategies. And that can be from designing them myself or helping organizations to design them. It can be carrying out the research, the surveys, to inform diversity and inclusion strategies. But more typically, it is about how we position, or how I position interventions to the clients I'm working with. So positioning it in relation to their diversity and inclusion strategies so that the initiatives make sense to them. The purpose of me telling you that is that throughout my career, I have interacted with a lot of those strategies. And through that, I suppose I found them wanting, and I find myself at my stage in career where I've had some time to really reflect on the content of diversity and inclusion strategies and to answer the question, are they fit for purpose? Now that question begs another question, which is fit for purpose for who? Who is the beneficiary of the diversity and inclusion strategy? For the purpose of my research and for this talk, my primary focus is the beneficiary are the individual members of staff who are working in the organisations that you work in. And the way it should benefit them is to ensure an inclusive and positive working experience where people can progress their careers. So that is the purpose that I'm particularly interested in, rather than how the organisation brands itself to the outside world, or how it uses the D&I strategies to further organisational objectives. I want to start by just getting you to think about your own organisations. No doubt, the majority of you will have some kind of diversity and inclusion strategy in place. It won't be all of you, but I imagine it will be a fair number. Thinking about that strategy, I would say it's a fair bet that the majority of your staff are aware that there is some kind of diversity and inclusion strategy within the organisation. I would also say it's a fair bet that that a very small proportion of those members of staff have read that diversity and inclusion strategy. And the problem that contains is that the presence of a D&I strategy raises expectations for members of staff. And without engaging with it, they won't see that strategy isn't necessarily designed to meet my needs and to benefit me due to my protected characteristics and my demographics. So by having a D&I strategy that doesn't meet the needs of everybody or prioritizes certain groups over others, we're raising the expectations without necessarily delivering. So I started the research with a sense of frustration that the strategies that I had been engaging with had these features as part of them. So what I saw was there was very much an orthodoxy in relation to the strategies, that they were talking about the same issues and their objectives. There seemed to be an awful lot of similarities between, and the initiatives to deal with them seemed very similar. So once you've read one D&I strategy, it feels like you've read them all. Secondly, I felt there was a real lack of transparency with D&I strategies, that they tend to publish the result of the thinking, of the analysis, and they highlight the positives that have occurred in the organization. But there's very often little sense of evaluation of the previous strategy cycle and informing people of what has and hasn't worked. So you get the good news, you get that, the positive headlines, but we're no closer to understanding, how these things have worked. I think the biggest thing, though, is that groups have continuously been overlooked, and there are certain demographic groups that tended to get more of the attention. And it goes back to my point, getting you to think about your own organizations and raising the expectations of everybody in their organization, that that feeling that everyone is going to be looked after because there's a D&I strategy in place. So it led me to this question: what leads to the identification and prioritization of D&I strategic objectives? So that's what we're going to be focusing on. So there are three sections to the talk. Initially, I want to share with you my exploratory research into the strategies of the FTSE 100. So I want to look at trends, I want to look at themes within those, and then also think about, what does that mean for you? So if you're sat here thinking, we're coming to the end of our strategy cycle, we are beginning to gear up for the next one, I want to leave you with thoughts to take into that process to enable you to maximize the chances of benefiting people in your organizations. When I started on this research, I assumed there would be a large body of research that informs how we should go about developing diversity and inclusion strategies, what makes them successful, what are the mechanics underpinning a good strategy. And I was sadly disappointed that there really wasn't much in the way of useful information that can inform practice in this area. I did, however, find quite a lot of criticism of diversity and inclusion strategies, some of which mirrored my own, maybe expressed in a harsher way. Just want to share some of those with you now. So the first one: the mistake they are making in their rush to be seen to be fixing the problem, businesses are getting caught in a flurry of copycat activity, a kind of virtue signaling arms race. And this is a very negative view of diversity and inclusion strategies, but I think it does capture something important. And it's something that I want to be focusing on during the talk, and that is this idea of benchmarking, of keeping an eye out on what everyone else is doing in your sector and making sure we're not missing out on it. And again, it's another one of those drivers of orthodoxy. The second quote is, I'll let you read it through, but it kind of sums up my fear of how organizations have responded and will continue to respond to the issue of race in organisations after the murder of George Floyd. Certainly, as a practitioner, I saw a flurry of activity and interventions in organisations about race and racism. And you know, the real concern, and it kind of chimes with my experience with my consultancy work today, is that response is no longer as live in organisations, and the concern that issues of race and racism may well be overlooked. So let me just talk through how I conducted the research. It was quite laborious, I have to say. So I came up with a list of the FTSE 100, and then I went to work exploring their websites, hunting down diversity and inclusion strategies. And this wasn't as easy to do as you might imagine. Some of these strategies are front and center of organizations' websites. They're very easy to navigate to. Others are hidden or buried or not necessarily meant to be found. So the question I asked is, do they have a strategy or a strategy that is available to the general public? And I'll share with you what I found in relation to that. The second thing I did was collected together all the strategy objectives coming out of those diversity and inclusion strategies, and carried out a content analysis to understand what are the major themes coming out, who are the main beneficiary groups, and what are the main focuses for people when they're developing their D&I strategies. And then the last thing I wanted to achieve is to try to understand what are the drivers of orthodoxy in relation to the way in which D&I strategies are produced. So let me just share with you the headline results. So firstly, I was able to find 53 diversity and inclusion strategies, 53 strategies, which broke down into 215 individual diversity and inclusion objectives from those strategies. 43 of the organizations had no D&I information available in relation to any kind of strategy. The difference between the 43 and the 53, 6 organizations had very limited diversity and inclusion policy in place without any meaningful objectives. So I took those objectives and carried out the content analysis, and the result you can see on the left of the screen. So I've ranked them in terms of what are the most common themes that were observed. And we see, I'll just run you through, just to talk you through what are the main breakdowns within each of these areas. So in tied first place was fair processes and inclusion. So the fair processes broke down into 2 areas. It's an attention or a focus on making sure that policy and practice is fair and inclusive, and that was achieved, or was due to be achieved, in a number of ways. Firstly, through consultation with employee resource groups, but also auditing work to understand how those processes interacted with different members of staff based on their difference. The inclusion theme was, they were quite broad and generic objectives about creating inclusion, most of them to be achieved through assigning members of staff, and particularly managers, with key performance indicators in relation to inclusion. So it's the idea that if we commit to it, we will do it, and it will be measured. So those were the 2 most popular. The third on the list was gender. And this was no surprise to me, I have to say, that of all the protected characteristics, this is the one that gained the most support. In more than 50% of strategy documents, this was in the kind of key objectives list. Next on our list of themes was psychological safety. This seemed to be quite a trendy area to focus in on. This was all about giving people voice, and this was done to be achieved through employee resource groups, which we'll come back to later on, but also through manager and leadership training to understand their impact on the staff that they manage. For customer-facing organisations, and certainly didn't include all of them in the FTSE 100, as you can imagine, they would have objectives about increasing the experience for their diverse customers. So that again ranks quite high. To back up the inclusion theme, there was also a very strong focus on ensuring that leaders were trained to be inclusive in their leadership practices. And then just coming on to the last four, ethnicity was the second group that was explicitly mentioned in an objective, and this was in terms of goals for levels of representation for ethnic minority staff. After that, and far less common, was representation of other protected characteristics. So within this, we've got sexual orientation, religion, disability, but these were far lower down on the pecking order. Education featured very strongly across the board as a way to deliver some of these objectives. And the one that I was pleased it was in the top 10, but was surprised it didn't rank higher, was to improve data collection approaches in organizations. So data collection in terms of demographics we are collecting from our staff, and also in terms of when we collect that information, how we link it into our systems and processes along the employee life cycle so that we can see how different groups perform. So that's the top 10 list. There was an awful lot of similarity between the reports, between the strategies. So next, I turn my attention to the orthodoxy and what leads to that. And I just want to talk through what I see from my reading of these strategies are the things that really promote similarity of approach. The first of which is legislation. And I think this is a force for good. Legislation, particularly in relation to the gender pay gap. And the reporting of gender pay gaps has been a requirement for some years now. And it has meant that organizations both have had to get far more sophisticated in how they collect data in relation to gender, but also they are publishing this information publicly and need to see improvement. And so this is feeding into the need to focus on gender in organizations. My thought associated with this is if we make this a requirement in relation to other protected characteristics, place a bit more pressure on organizations, we may see more traction in other areas. The second area is benchmarking. It is when I talk to my clients, one of the questions they seem really fascinated by is, what are my competitors doing in the sector? How do I compare with them? And for me, this always is quite problematic because, in my view, no organization has got diversity and inclusion sorted. And so what organizations are doing through that competitive benchmarking process is comparing themselves against organizations that they shouldn't necessarily be aspiring to. And because of that, we tend to get replication. And also, I would say it kind of lowers the level at which we can achieve. So I think we tend to copy what we're doing across organizations. The third area, I'm blaming the United Nations. I'm not going to go into detail just yet. That will come in a subsequent slide. Just hold that thought. I think the United Nations are shaping what our D&I strategies look like. Fourth idea, low-hanging fruit. Since I've been working in diversity and inclusion, gender has always been up there in terms of what organizations are focusing in on. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think women are a very large underrepresented group. So from a data analytical point of view, it is easier to collect the data and also do some meaningful analysis of that data as well. And because women are, a large constituent part of organizations, quite rightly, there should be a focus on the experiences of women and to ensure that their experience is inclusive. My point in relation to this is, if it's low-hanging fruit, that fruit needs to be picked. We need to see progress to make some room to focus on other groups. So I've covered the drivers of orthodoxy. I want to focus in addition on some of the other trends that I saw when I was reviewing these strategies. So I'll go through these in turn in a moment, but just to give you the headlines, sustainability or recruitment is where D&I is related to in an organisational context. Second, intersectionality and micro-minority groups. There is limited focus on these. I'll explain more in a moment. Broad use of employee resource groups, my concerns that perhaps we are asking too much of those, and a lack of evaluation. So I'll take those in turn. So the sustainability or recruitment trend is this came from where I found the diversity and inclusion strategies on the various company websites, and some of them, as I said earlier, were very difficult to track down, and you learnt techniques to try to find them quickly. And one of the trends I saw was in terms of D&I being subsumed into the wider sustainability agenda, and that there wasn't necessarily a diversity and inclusion strategy that was standalone. It was part of that wider sustainability strategy. And there's an issue with that in that it can take focus away from diversity and inclusion. But the other thing that really concerned me was, coming back to it now, the UN. So what I noticed was that organizations were using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that's what you can see on the screen, as a way to structure their diversity and inclusion strategies. Five, I want to draw your attention to. So there was the way the UN explains this is that there is widespread consensus that progress on all of the Sustainable Development Goals will be stifled if gender equality isn't resolved, and so they place a greater emphasis on it than equality in other areas. And what I saw when organizations reported their strategies within this framework was there was a lot of emphasis on gender issues, and then equality and inclusion issues to do with other groups were shoehorned into box 10, which is reduced inequalities. But if you look at the detail of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, what you'll see is reduced inequalities is about financial inequality rather than workplace inequality. So it's a kind of a framework that doesn't quite suit the purpose. But this is a trend I think is beginning to shape what organizations are doing in this space at risks of overlooking certain groups. The recruitment bit was also very interesting. Again, some organizations, you scoured their websites to find any information on inclusion and diversity, and then you go to their jobs pages, and then suddenly you're greeted with warm-hearted, diverse pictures like the one on the screen. I won't name the organization, but it went along with this slogan on the left-hand side: "We're proud of our diverse working culture. It's what makes us." And my response to that is, if you are that proud of it, why is it not bigger on your website? Why is it not more prominent? And it's only seen when you have people who are trying to determine whether they should work for you as a kind of a reassurance. And it just starts to kind of eat away at sincerity, I would say. So that's one of the trends I saw, that D&I was starting to be associated with either sustainability or recruitment and taken away from the mainstream of the organization. The second trend was around intersectionality. Just let you read this quote. It's quite a long quote, so hopefully you've had a chance to read that. I agree with the majority of that quote. The part I disagree with, or the part I would add, is that I see intersectionality as relevant for researchers and for practitioners because it gives the potential for enhanced analytical sophistication. And the trend I saw that really intersectionality was not being talked about. I think I only found one strategy that focused on intersectionality, and that was an organization that was reporting on an event they did for Black gay members of staff. So that intersection, and that was the extent of their focus on intersectionality. And being somebody who's helped develop diversity and inclusion strategies, what is often required is evidence to commit resources to a particular cause or group. And because of this, groups are tended to be lumped together. So from an ethnicity point of view, very often there isn't sufficient data to look at the different ethnic groups, or different ethnic groups by sexual orientation or faith. And because of that, we are prevented from seeing the different barriers for particular people who have various intersections. And so I think it's a real miss. I'm going to talk more about what we can do about that later on. The second trend related to grouping was something that I made up a name for, because I haven't seen a name for it. I'm calling it micro-minority groups. It's related, but there are certain minority groups in organizations, due to their prevalence in society, that when you have a certain organizational size, the sample of staff is so small that you can't do any meaningful statistical tests on that grouping. And so therefore, when it comes to making decisions about that group and their experiences, those groups are overlooked because we don't have the statistics to back it up. And again, I'll come to a remedy to help in that area. The third trend that I saw was in relation to employee resource groups. Looking at the Fortune 500, something like 95% of Fortune 500 companies have employee resource groups. From my research, I certainly saw that they were very popular within the FTSE 100 as well. My concern in relation to these groups is that they seem to be deployed for multiple reasons, and there isn't always clarity on their purpose and the expected outcomes, or for the experiences of those who are members of these employee resource groups. So in terms of individual outcomes, I just want to share with you some of the evidence of their effectiveness. And this is probably the strongest evidence in relation to employee resource groups. Being a member of an employee resource groups has shown to have an impact on your perception of your own career potential, and also to enhance your individual network within your organization. As well as that, another individual benefit that's kind of evidence, but not in a really strong way, is that they are valued by individuals as a source of support to help vocalize and deal with different sources of discrimination experienced in that organization by individuals. The second use for employee resource groups has been around organizational outcomes, and some organizations use them to get real value and to drive the hitting of organizational targets. But interestingly, sometimes there is a disjoint between the expectations of the members and the expectations of the senior leadership. So in one study that I read as part of this research, it looked at the experiences of women who were part of female networks and organizations, and they thought their involvement both would have individual benefits to them, but also would enable them to help the organization achieve their goals. The researchers also looked at the perspectives of the senior leaders in that organization, who only saw these groups as ways to help individual women. They didn't see the benefit of these groups for their organizational, reaching their organizational goals.
I'm a professor of law.
Another critique.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got some background noise. If I could just ask people to mute themselves, that'd be great. The third area, and another critique of employee resource groups, is that these groups give individual members voice and an environment to speak up, to talk about their experiences. But what hasn't necessarily been delivered is the power to affect change in organizations, to make changes to how people are treated. And that has been seen by research as being quite a demotivating experience. A couple of other areas that it's worth focusing in on. Representation. There is very limited evidence that these groups actually have a positive impact in the levels of representation of diverse groups. So one study conducted looking at data over 41 years, over 708 companies, found there was a modest impact on representation of female managers. There was no impact on men or black women, and there was a negative impact on black men. So you know, if it's a representation angle, it certainly isn't the mechanism to use. And then finally, a concern of these groups that they segregate groups, that they don't respect people's multiple identities, because they are often, well, they always seem to be constructed around a singular area of identity. The gender network, the race and ethnicity network, the disability network, and what it doesn't do is talk to those multiple identities that people have. And finally, a warning in the form of a quote. So it's this idea that being involved in these groups, and this is from a racial perspective, in an uncompensated fashion, can be a very negative experience for people. So there's a real need to use these processes in a way that's very deliberate, where we're sure of the rules of engagement. And the final trend, before I get to implications for you, is that of evaluation. And you know, the question that was going through my head as I was reading through these diversity and inclusion strategies were, why are these published, and who are they published for? You know, what is the purpose of publicly publishing this diversity and inclusion strategy? And I'm afraid I came to quite a cynical conclusion that they are a good way of being able to communicate a positive message to staff, to potential staff, and to the outside world that we are doing activity in this area. If it's an organisation that, you know, is seeking investment, that you know, that they're doing things in the right way. And as such, these strategies often tended to be very positive in outlook. So they were really quite celebratory in, you know, where there was positive benefits seen from the previous policy cycle or strategy cycle. So you know, lots of attention drawn to when representation was increased, but you know, of course, there was no note of where things had failed, and the strategies themselves did kind of contained pseudo evidence, but it was often in the form of sound bites and case studies rather than anything meatier to really get your teeth into. And there weren't evaluations of specific D&I initiatives, and you know, D&I is such a broad area. There are many moving parts to a diversity and inclusion strategy, so that there wasn't the ability to identify what you have done and what has been the benefit of that thing. So I want to end this before we go into questioning, just to think through what are the implications for you. And as I said earlier, you know, some of you may be responsible for a diversity and inclusion strategy in your own organisation. You may have, you know, the role akin to the Chief Diversity Officer. What is it that you should be thinking about? So I've got some ideas for you. The first is related to benchmarking, and I use the term competitive benchmarking earlier on, this kind of sense of what are they doing, we need to do a bit of it and probably do it a little bit better. Collaborative benchmarking is a way to work with others in your sector to better understand the issues within both your organisation and other similar organisations. And it links directly to this idea that micro minority groups, often the numbers involved are not sufficient to do analysis. So therefore we can't talk to the experience of people from those groups, and they tend to get overlooked. When I worked for IES 20 years ago, when we were there, we used to do surveys for the NHS, and we carried out employment surveys for about 100 plus NHS organisations, and it had a huge amount of data collected across those various organisations. And it strikes me that that kind of activity has real potential to understand the experience of micro minority groups. So collaborative in the sense that organizations will ask the same questions from a survey perspective to their staff, and then that data can be analyzed across organizations so that we can identify what are the issues that affect certain micro minority groups to provide clarity. So that's one idea that that I think would be really beneficial, so that those groups are not overlooked. I think the other associated one is qualitative research, where we can't crunch the numbers. We need to really understand the experience of people in micro minority groups by carrying out that qualitative research, understanding lived experiences, and linking that into the diversity and inclusion strategies that we're producing. The third idea for you is setting expectations when you collect demographic groups, and it's linked to what I was saying earlier about, just by having a diversity and inclusion strategy gives people the expectation that diversity and inclusion will be improved for me rather than for the entire organization. And for some groups, even if they share their demographic information, because they may be part of one of these micro minority groups, their views will never be analysed in relation to how well that group is experiencing life, how well they're progressing, how they view their relationship with their manager. All those questions will go unanswered. But also at the same time, it's worth remembering that sharing demographic information can be a risky business. And some people may feel exposed by sharing that information, even if there is the promise of anonymity and confidentiality. And if people don't see a return in the way they expect when they share that information, they will stop sharing it. I'm working with a client at the moment to develop a diversity and inclusion survey. And one of the things that we put into that survey is guidance for people to help them understand how their data would be used, and to set the expectation that it's likely based on the organisation size that we'll be able to analyse gender and ethnicity, but other groups we are likely not to have sufficient data to be able to do so. And sharing that information will enable us to understand levels of representation, and that we will follow up through qualitative means. The fourth, again, is to do with data, and it's sophistication around that data, to ensure that you understand how data is linked to the employee life cycle. I work with lots of organizations where I have a very similar conversation, where I say, so do you collect demographic information? And they say, yes, our system collects it. And then I say, well, what do you do with it? And they say, well, we don't really do much with it at all. It's just there. It's just part of that, part of the way we do things. And there is a real need to link the data that is collected to outcomes of people from those different demographic groups, so that we can inform the strategy and to see how different processes are working. So I suppose the message there is that your data collection may be more sophisticated than you imagine, and may give you far more scope to do things with than you had thought. And then finally, I want to advocate for inclusive leadership development. There are certainly gaps in the provision for people depending on their demographic grouping. Some groups will be overlooked. And in terms of how people are treated, an educated, informed, self-aware body of leaders and managers who can understand inclusion and understand their interactions with people based on difference is so very important. And also leaders and managers who are committed to learning, to exploring, and also not always getting it right. I was working with an organization very recently, and halfway through, and it was an inclusive leadership session, one person in the room put their hand up and said, well, this is just management training. And I said, in a way, you're right, but also we're telling you that your management or leadership towards somebody is mitigated by your biases, your preferences, and who you feel most comfortable with. So people will get a different leadership experience of you. And leaders being able to understand that their leadership is variable depending on who is consuming it or who's receiving it is very important. So I've covered a lot of ground. I probably do need to stop talking. So I would like to open it up to questioning from you.
Hi, Rob. Thank you for that. That's great, and we're going to go into questions in a moment. Emma, before we go into questions, would you mind stopping the recording? Questions on this issue, and just doing a fantastic job. So thank you, Rob, for that. We have some people on the call today who are part of the ISHR network. So for those people, just a reminder about the upcoming events. There's one in March around recruitment, and then there's our annual conference in April, which will look at fairness at work, and we'll cover a number of different themes in that around pay and reward, health and wellbeing, diversity and inclusion. So just a reminder about that. If you're not a member of the ISHR network and you're interested in finding out about it, then please do get in touch, and we're happy to spend some time to talk you through it. So thank you very much for joining us today. We will send the slides and a recording of the presentation after, and so thank you very much for your time and attention today and your questions. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.